Welcome to episode 15 of the Automation Podcast, brought to you by InsightsInAutomation.com. I'm Shawn Tierney, your host, and on today's show, we'll be discussing how you access the configuration mode of your PanelView Plus, or PanelView Plus 6, or PanelView Plus CE, or VersaView CE. Wow, lots of names for this product line, right? Well, let's get right to it. Now, typically, when you design your FactoryTalk View Studio Machine Edition project, you're going to add a Go to Config button in your project somewhere. And when you don't, that's where you kind of run into problems, right? So the easiest way to access the configuration mode is to actually put your Go to Configuration button in your project. And one thing you'll notice in new versions of View Studio, they actually put one in there for you on a default main screen, which is also set as the default startup screen, which if you didn't have one of those leads to some other issues. But back to the Go to Config. Let's say you forget your Go to Config button and you lock yourself out of the program. Well, as long as you still can download a project to it, just go ahead and fire up View Studio, make a new project, and on that project have one screen, a default screen that has a Go to Config button. Create a runtime, use the transfer utility to download that project to your PanelView Plus with the checkboxes selected to run this project on startup, and voila, the PanelView Plus will reboot, you'll have your Go to Config button, and you can get back into the configuration menu. But let's say you've inherited the PanelView Plus or you're working on somebody else's PanelView Plus and you don't know what the IP address is. Now what do? Well, in some firmware versions of the PanelView Plus and PanelView Plus 6, when you boot the unit up, you'll see a little white square in the bottom left-hand corner. If you press that during boot, or on the keypad units you can press F1, that will break you into the configuration mode. So the versions that support the little white box or F1 are versions 3.20.09 through versions 5.1, as well as version 6.1 and greater. So with version 6.1, just installing that firmware doesn't enable it. You also have to exit Machine Edition on your PanelView Plus. The default password is password, by the way. And then once you see the Windows CE desktop, you need to open up the control panel, go into System, go into Startup Options, then Boot Option, and select the text safe mode for the white box or the F1 key to work. Otherwise, if you're stuck with version 6.0, it's designed to require a USB keyboard to break back into the configuration mode. Now, for those situations where you forget to put a Go to Config mode button in your View Studio project, and you don't have the ability to download a new project with a Go to Config button in it, and you can't flash the firmware to get a version of the firmware that'll give you the white box or the F1 key as a means to get into the configuration mode, one of the last things you can try is running a script on the USB stick. It's a little known fact that if you have a file named AutoRunBat, that's AutoRun.bat, on your USB stick, when you stick it into your PanelView Plus, it'll automatically run, and you can write a script to copy or rename your default project, forcing your PanelView Plus 6 into the configuration mode when you reboot it. Now, this script is kind of cryptic, so I've included a link in the blog post for this podcast to a blog I wrote at theautomationblog.com that runs you through the text needed in this AutoRun.bat file for both the PanelView Plus 6 and the older PanelView Plus version 3.1 through 5.1. Now, if all else fails and you have a PanelView Plus 7 or greater, you can always remove the logic board from the back of the display, take the internal memory out of the unit, put it into your computer, and search for .mer files. I don't recommend you do this because we have all these other means of getting into the configuration mode, but that is a trick I had to use back in the day before all these other methods were known. And that's it for this episode of the Automation Podcast. Again, I'm going to include links to document everything I talked about in today's show in the blog post for this podcast. So don't feel like you have to rewind the podcast and take notes because there'll be links in the blog post. Now, if you have any questions, comments, or corrections, please don't hesitate to share them with us. And the way you would do that is just reply to the blog post for this podcast at theautomationpodcast.com. And you can always stay up to date with all the Insights websites at InsightsInAutomation.com or by connecting with me on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn, where I'm known as Mr. Shawn Tierney. Before we go, let's take a look at what's coming up in our next podcast. Tune in for our next podcast, episode 16, where we discuss how you add Data Highway 485 to a Slick 504, Slick 505, or a new PanelView Plus 6, 400, and 600. Well, that's it for episode 15 of the Automation Podcast. I'm your host, Shawn Tierney, and until next time, peace.